On the 7th of October 2023, some Harvard students published a letter on Instagram responding to Hamas's attack in Israel. Usually political statements from students are ignored, but not this one.
Intense backlash after they released a letter which blamed Israel.
They wrote, "We, the undersigned student organizations, hold the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all the unfolding violence."
The student letter provoked lots of criticism, but it also provoked something more.
Schooled on hate is the front page of the New York Post, and Bill Ackman is saying, look, if you're one of these students, I want to know who you are, because in the business world, we ain't gonna hire you.
Critics started collecting the names and photos of all the students involved in a document titled College Terror List, a helpful guide for employers. Soon job offers started to be withdrawn, and then things went further.
A digital billboard parked right outside Harvard University is attracting a lot of attention. The names and faces of Harvard students, which we have blurred, are displayed under the title Harvard's Leading Anti-Semites.
And he sent trucks not just to university campuses, but also to the individual homes of students. And he told me that he's prepared to go even further. And potentially when a lot of these students graduate, they may wake up one day and see a doxing truck parked outside of their employer.
Defenders of these tactics argued they were just exercising their free speech rights of criticism. But notice, tactics like this aren't debating the question, to what extent Israel was responsible for Hamas. Instead, they aimed just to shut down the person speaking, using blackmail and threats. In other words, this was an example of, yes, I'm gonna say it, cancel culture. In fact, since October the 7th, there's been lots of attacks from the right on pro-Palestinian speech, with events cancelled, authors disinvited, people losing their jobs, and political cartoonists fired. We've seen lawmakers in the US demanding the expulsion of students, even deportations, threats to withdraw funding from universities, and bans on student groups. And in recent weeks, we've seen university authorities calling in riot police to break up campus protests, even when they're peaceful.
You have 2 minutes to pack up your belongings and disperse the area.
Now, usually when you hear about cancel culture, the story is about the left. But this narrative misses how many attacks to free speech are now coming from the right. In this video, I want to look at these attacks, why the left needs to defend the ideal of free speech, and what it means for the most marginalised if we don't. Let's start with higher education, which is often in the news for cancellation campaigns organised by left-wing students. However, analysis by FIRE, who defend freedom of speech from left and right-wing attacks, showed that around 40% of all recorded cancellations against academics have come from the right. There have been academics fired for criticising COVID-19 policies, for demanding the removal of Confederate statues, and even harmless jokes. FIRE has also assembled a database of all deplatforming attempts at universities since 1998, and its numbers show 49% of these have originated from the right. Academics are also targeted by outside groups like Turning Point USA, that keep a McCarthy at Professor watchlist, and campaign groups on social media.
Libs of TikTok targets these influencers and encourages followers to send them abusive messages and accuse these teachers of being groomers and accuse them of child abuse.
High schools are another area where some conservatives have gone full into cancel culture. The Washington Post found at least 31 teachers in 2 years who had lost their jobs for political speech after being targeted by conservatives. One for writing an email to students encouraging them to be anti-racist, one for displaying a Black Lives Matter flag, and one for posting this video to his private TikTok.
Hey, if your parents don't love and accept you for who you are this Christmas, f them. I'm your parents now. I'm proud of you. Drink some water. I love you. Bye.
One of the most high-profile examples of conservative cancel culture in education was Nicole Hannah-Jones, the journalist behind the controversial 1619 project. When Hannah-Jones was offered a tenured position teaching journalism in 2021, the job offer was blocked following opposition from conservatives. This Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist obviously had enough qualifications to teach 18-year-old college students about journalism, but because she had the wrong politics, because she was saying the wrong things, she was cancelled. In fact, the 1619 project has sent conservative politicians a bit bonkers, with at least 2 state legislatures specifically trying to ban its use in higher education, which is kind of a wild response when you consider that these are just basically history essays in a magazine. These proposed laws are part of a wider attempt to outlaw woke ideas. For instance, the Stop Woke Act in Florida aims to prohibit 8 concepts that Republicans see as harmful, with universities restricted from discussing, to pick one example, the idea that racial colorblindness could be racist. These laws are often based on subjective criteria.
The Stop Woke Act would prohibit Florida's public schools and private businesses from making people feel uncomfortable or guilty over their race, sex, or national origin.
And they're often dangerously vague. For example, the so-called Don't Say Gay law in Florida prohibits instruction on issues of gender and sexuality. But what exactly does that mean?
Because then they ask, well, what does partner mean, Mr. Bernard? And, you know, I'm worried, can I tell them what it means? I'm also worried for my kids. I have a little girl this year who has 2 moms, and the kids are curious about her 2 moms. They want to know about her 2 moms.
Now look, I get the argument that as school is compulsory, what's taught there should be subject to democratic oversight. But often these laws target higher education. In other words, you have adults in a classroom, there by choice, talking ideas with their professors, and the state is there saying what can and can't be discussed. That isn't something that the right used to support. Okay, what have we got next?
More than 3,000 book bans in schools last year, 1,000 more than the year before.
According to a report from the American Library Association, over 1,900 books were targeted for suppression in 2023.
If someone is demonstrably harming our children, we are going to come together to fight to protect them.
Banned books include The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, Here's Atwood with a special edition printed on fire-retardant paper, and an illustrated version of Anne Frank's diaries. And we're not just talking about restricting what books are set in class or set for homework, we're talking about libraries, school libraries, but even public libraries. And it gets worse.
So that's 2 Republican state senators in Missouri with flamethrowers in a video that went viral this week. But as one of the senators, Republican gubernatorial candidate Bill Eigel told the Kansas City Star, quote, "In the video, I am taking a flamethrower to cardboard boxes." He then added, quote, "Let's be clear. You bring those woke pornographic books to Missouri schools to try to brainwash our kids, and I'll burn those too."
Yes, we're talking about Nazi-style book burning. Okay, so there we have a little tour of the American right's attacks on free speech and expression. And I think you can see them all as acts of cancelling, which I want to define as campaigns to suppress ideas or to get people fired, disinvited, deplatformed or otherwise punished for speech. That is any response that uses force rather than speech to win the argument. Now I should say here, a lot of free speech discussion focuses on the First Amendment of the US Constitution and the actions of the government. But actually in this video I want to take a step back and look at ideals. And the ideal I want to argue for is when the response to bad ideas, bad speech, is not cancelling using intimidation, threats, doxing truck, which are all fundamentally acts of force, coercion and power, but rather the ideal I want is where the response to bad ideas or speech is criticism, argument or some other kind of speech. It's what we might call the spirit of the First Amendment, a world where bad ideas are criticised and argued with rather than countered with force. And more specifically, I want to argue that this ideal isn't just good in general, but it's good for progressives, socialists, and everyone on the left of politics. Now generally, cancel culture has been a conservative issue.
Up yours, woke moralists.
And I'll be honest, for a long time, the complaints I heard from these conservatives bored me. I could see the professors targeted, the speakers disinvited and deplatformed, the people kicked off social media platforms. But there were a whole bunch of counter-arguments going through my head, often made by people I admire. And I think it's worth going through them. First was the point, are these people really cancelled?
You read a lot of articles and papers by people complaining about cancel culture, and you think, in what world are you cancelled? I'm reading your article in a newspaper, or you're doing interviews about how terrible it is to be cancelled.
This makes sense, right? Often the so-called cancelled people seem to just carry on their careers. This title from Cody Johnson kind of sums up this argument. Cancel culture isn't a thing, you snowflakes. Next was an argument about hypocrisy.
Cancel culture only seems to exist when people from certain demographics or people associated with one particular end of the political spectrum express outrage and go after those with institutional and social power.
In other words, those complaining about free speech always ignore attacks from the right, even when those attacks have the backing of the state. Another argument is that these are really just complaints about criticism.
That a lot of the time cancel culture is just, it's people being mad at your shitty opinion.
The whole cancel culture hypothesis was an opportunistic attempt by media figures who would prefer to operate in a scenario in which their communication with the general public was entirely one way to delegitimize any criticism of their words or actions.
In other words, this is a story about a media dominated by the right who just can't handle marginalised people speaking back for once. Added to all this is a skepticism that even debating these ideas is worthwhile.
And I know you believe in something called the free marketplace of ideas. You believe that the best ideas will come out on top so long as their proponents are given a fair chance to argue for them. That must be a very comforting belief, but I regret to say I don't share the optimism.
What's more, there's something distasteful about wanting to sit around and discuss things when in the real world people are suffering.
Because it can lead you to this kind of toxic centrism that asks, why are marginalized people so unwilling to have calm, philosophical debates about whether they should have rights? Are they afraid of dangerous ideas?
This takes us to the next argument, that, if we're brutally honest, illiberal, forceful methods are necessary to achieve change.
I mean, it's a nice thought that we can just politely persuade everyone to give us rights, but the reality is, that's not how this works, and it never has been. Like, how do these debate me centrists think that slavery ended in the United States? Well, between 1861 and 1865, there was a little event called the American Civil Debate. See what I'm holding in my hand? This is a high caliber idea that I picked off the polite discussion field of Manassas.
In other words, polite debate is pointless, and the only real way to make progress is with force. Another argument is that some debates are so repugnant they don't merit protection.
As a gay man, I'd give an example. It used to be a live debate that gay people were associated with paedophilia. That was a mainstream view. We would say now, of course we shouldn't be having that discussion or that debate.
The next argument that is sometimes made is that some speech is directly harmful.
We don't want you to speak here! Your words are violent!
As the argument is sometimes put, words can cause stress, and stress can cause physical harm, and thus words can be a form of violence. The final criticism of free speech I want to talk about can be seen in this video Vice made about the Bret Weinstein controversy.
Would you like to hear the answer or not?
No! Are you gonna get it?
The professor had objected to an anti-racist day of absence, but when student protests against him went viral, the students started getting threats.
We received a threat saying that people will come here and execute every single person they see on campus at that point. Yeah. Free speech.
Yeah. When we're dead, when people die, and you're sitting here like, well, at least they got to practice their free speech. I'm so sorry about it. Your free speech is not more important than the lives of like black, trans, femmes, and students on this campus. I'm so sorry. Exactly. Hate to break it to you.
Bret has not personally said, you know, go out and attack these students, go out and threaten these students. That has been the result of his actions. He has incited white supremacists and he has validated white supremacists and Nazis in our community and in the nation. And I don't think that should be protected by free speech.
In other words, if views can lead to real life harm, they shouldn't be protected by free speech. It all adds up to a powerful critique, and I'll be honest, for a long time, it's one I was very sympathetic with. But seeing what's happening with the right's attacks on free speech, and considering this all a bit more deeply, I want to reply to these ideas and also set out the positive case for why the left should support this ideal of free speech. First, let's consider this point that few are really cancelled. It's true that some cancelled people don't really go away. For example, Bret Weinstein, the professor we met earlier, now has a career talking conspiracy theories on podcasts and YouTube. But cancelling tactics, attacks on the person rather than the idea, often work through intimidation. Even if the original person survives, others have been warned. I mean, look at the Harvard students who lost their job offers, or the educators targeted by conservatives. I mean, they could still get work elsewhere, but I don't think that means there's no problem. Also, the data is stronger than I realised. I mentioned earlier the database kept by FIRE, the bipartisan free speech group. Well, since 2014 to today, they've recorded more than 1,000 attempts to get professors fired, punished, or otherwise silenced, with 200 terminations. To put that in perspective, the Red Scare, famous for its blacklists and censorship, only led to an estimated 100 to 150 professors having their jobs terminated. In other words, cancelling is definitely a thing. Sorry, Cody. Okay, that's the first one. Next we have the idea that the complaints about free speech are hypocritical. And in many ways I agree. As I've shown in this video, the right is attacking free speech, despite all its complaints about cancel culture. And it's also true that people claim cancel culture for all sorts of things, including accusations of sexual assault that have nothing to do with free speech. So, okay, there's hypocrisy. But of course, hypocrisy isn't a defense. Just because your opponents do something doesn't mean it's right or useful for you to do the same. The next argument is that cancelling is just criticism.
Delegitimize any criticism of their words or action.
But while I agree some cancel culture complaints are bogus, For me, cancelling is very different from criticism. In fact, cancelling, silencing the idea rather than challenging it, is the opposite of criticism, replacing it with an act of power or force. That's what it is when people use the law to ban ideas from schools or use blacklists to intimidate. They're not winning the argument with speech or better ideas, but with power. And this doesn't mean, by the way, that all free speech has to be polite discussion.
Why are marginalized people so unwilling to have calm, philosophical debates about whether they should have rights?
It's the difference between a protest outside a meeting expressing disapproval of a view and a protest that tries to stop the meeting so that no one can even hear that view. It's the difference between protesting with posters and ripping down posters you don't agree with. Between telling someone they're wrong on social media and trying to get them fired from their job. I'm not saying there shouldn't be protests, strikes, direct action, but the test is, if you're making a point, you shouldn't be stopping others from making theirs. Okay, so we can reject the idea that cancelling is criticism, which is lucky because criticism is one of the key reasons the left should support free speech. This is because free speech, such as criticism, allows the left to persuade others. Now I realise to many this will feel hopelessly naive, a foolish belief in the marketplace of ideas, when the reality is debate doesn't work, and if you really want to make progress, then you have to be prepared to use illiberal methods.
But the reality is, that's not how this works, and it never has been.
Now, I'm not a pacifist. I agree there might be times when force or violence is required, but that doesn't mean persuasion doesn't work. At one point in the video, Natalie Wynn airs her frustration with an opponent of trans rights.
I am really curious to know how Michelle Goldberg thinks that past liberation movements have succeeded. Did suffragettes just have calm, civil conversations about whether women are intellectually capable of voting until all the misogynists were rationally persuaded?
And Natalie has a point, as the suffragettes were often violent. On screen is a list of just the bombings they organised, but there was also arson, booby traps, and assassination. But as well as the more radical suffragettes, there were also non-violent suffragists. A lot more of them, in fact. And although it might be less exciting, look at the history, you'll see that persuasion, the force of ideas, civil discussion were part of the history of women getting the vote. And that's not unusual, from the recent gay marriage campaigns to changes in drug laws, or think of the many left-wing governments who've been voted into power over the years. More regularly than some people seem to realise, the left makes progress using argument. It's ironic that Natalie makes these arguments when her videos are so persuasive and have changed so many people's minds, including my own. Yes, some bigots won't ever change their mind, but there are others who will listen, and often it's those people who are important for mobilising hard power. For example, the anti-slavery and civil rights movements needed free speech, not necessarily to change the minds of Southern hardliners, but to strengthen the resolve of the North, which had the hard power to force change. This is why anti-racist campaigners have historically supported free speech. Frederick Douglass calling it the dread of tyrants, and Ida B. Wells, the anti-lynching activist, calling her newspaper the Memphis Free Speech. It's why civil rights icon John Lewis said, "Without freedom of speech, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings." And these supporters of free speech weren't debate me centrists. They were people with horrific personal experience of injustice, certainly more than many of today's skeptics. As well as persuading others, free speech also improves the ideas of the left. For example, many socialists in the past argued for collectivizing agriculture and complete central planning of the economy. Today, however, most socialists have adapted their ideas, partly in response to criticism. Or another example, many socialists used to believe in eugenics. It was a time before the Holocaust and it seemed like a progressive scientific idea. Key members of the UK Labour Party, social reformers, liberal economists all supported it. I bring up these examples because I think some of the reason the left has supported cancellation is its confidence in being on the right side of history. And this is understandable because on many issues it has been on the right side of history. But sometimes we get things wrong. And if we care about the people and causes we say we do, we need to know that. And the best way for that to happen is to live in a world where people are free to criticise us. In fact, even if our ideas are right, criticism can help by invigorating our ideas. To explain what I mean, look at this clip of Kaya Raichik, the creator of Libs of TikTok, being asked why she opposes trans rights.
Right, but I'm saying what's the harm of people expressing their gender identity differently than you believe it to be? What harm are they causing?
Like I said, we are a nation of truth, and I seek the truth.
But I'm asking about the harm. What's the harm? You might believe it to be false, but what's
the harm? The harm is that there's a lie that is very mainstream and is being embedded into every institution.
It seems to me that the reason why Kaya Rajcik's ideas about trans rights are so nothing is that she's never had to debate them. She's learnt them by rote, living in an echo chamber of other conservatives. So I know debate is kind of out of fashion at the moment, but for me I find it hard to understand how anyone can hold their beliefs with any kind of life or vitality without this process of expression and challenge. And this gets to another point. Free speech is worthwhile as a freedom in itself. Just as we want people to be free from poverty, freedom to speak is important too. Whether it's the idea that Israel is responsible for Hamas or that racism is an intractable part of American society, people should be free to express ideas others disagree with. It's freedom to think, freedom to be, and it's a world I think the left should be fighting for. The next argument is that some debates are repugnant and don't deserve protection. Just as we wouldn't debate the virtues of slavery or paedophilia, so some of today's debates should be out of bounds.
Of course we shouldn't be having that discussion or that debate.
It's true that a debate sets up opposing views as equally valid, and sometimes this isn't deserved. But this idea that there's something shameful debating bad ideas, like you'll catch something, I think is a mistake. And going further and stopping others having debates, even repugnant ones, is a mistake as well. Not just because the left has a proud history of debating and winning the argument, but because, and this is another point, cancelling can backfire. Now there are some defenders of free speech that say suppression doesn't work, ideas always survive, but actually I accept that cancelling can be effective. Intimidation, fear, force, it can work. That's why these tactics are so popular. But it can go wrong. It can make those ideas seem more glamorous, and it can push them into spaces where they flourish because no one's challenging them there. For example, when Twitter purged accounts in August 2018, there was, according to this study, a surge of users The Gap, a right-wing Twitter alternative. In fact, it happened each time Twitter deplatformed extremists. But once on these alternative platforms, the users are exposed to even less view diversity than before. Their ideas go unchallenged, and the rest of us might not even realise what's going on until it's too late.
Bowers, the accused gunman at Tree of Life Synagogue, posted just minutes before the attack, quote, "I'm going in."
Next, we have the idea that some speech, because of the harmful stress it causes, is a form of violence and thus shouldn't be protected.
Your words are violence!
I guess I can see where this argument is coming from, though at least with verbal abuse you can choose whether it affects you, at least in theory, in a way that's not true of, say, a punch. And it does worry me if these arguments about more abstract forms of violence end up justifying real violence. But okay, let's pause this one and move on to the idea that some speech leads to harm and thus shouldn't be protected.
He has incited white supremacists and he has validated white supremacists and Nazis in our community and in the nation. And I don't think that should be protected by free speech.
So here the argument is that while someone, Brett Weinstein in this example, might have said or done something quite small, their actions support something bigger. A visual representation of this idea is the pyramid of hate from the Anti-Defamation League, where biased attitudes can lead to acts of bias, such as non-inclusive language and insensitive remarks, belittling jokes, ridicule, that support discrimination, violence, and ultimately genocide. Now personally, this all feels like it's stretching it a bit, but let's, for the sake of argument, accept these arguments about harm. The real danger comes when our opponents use these same arguments on us. I mean, many conservatives clearly see left-wing ideas as harmful.
Demonstrably harming our children, we are going to come together to fight to protect them.
If we argue for suppressing free speech on subjective criteria such as feeling distress or other negative emotions, what's to stop the right doing the same to us?
Would prohibit making people feel uncomfortable or guilty over their race, sex, or national origin.
If we mark some debates as repugnant and out of bounds, what's to stop the right doing the same about debates on racism, gender, or Israel? Even hate speech laws could backfire on the left. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned a cartoonist who'd been fired. Apparently he used an anti-Semitic trope about a pound of flesh in this cartoon, even though the cartoon's quite clearly a reference to this famous cartoon of President Johnson, which Bell even references in the original. If the left worries that accusations of anti-Semitism are being used to silence pro-Palestinian speech, then they should be cautious about hate speech laws in general. All of free speech is, like all liberal institutions, reciprocal. If you use force and cancel their speech, they'll cancel yours. Now of course, if you're powerful, you can cancel anything you like, and you don't have to worry about reprisals. I think this is the natural instinct of any political group that finds itself in a space where it's powerful. But this is the thing. In wider society, outside of university or social media, the left and its ideas are often not powerful. If you want to talk about race, gender, Israel, Palestine, there are, as everyone knows, powerful interests in opposition. More generally, radical, progressive ideas always start off as weak and unpopular. That's almost what it means to be radical. Liberal rights like free speech are designed to protect the weak against the powerful, the few against the many, and that's often who the left are standing up for. If we reject liberal institutions and just have a clash of power, that doesn't sound too good for those the left is meant to represent. And it's because of who free speech helps that reactionaries and authoritarians across the world restrict it. And it's why people fight for it.
We will revoke the student visas of radical anti-American and anti-Semitic foreigners at our colleges and universities, and we will send them straight back home. They go back home. Enjoy your life.
In the past few years, many conservatives have raised concerns about free speech and cancel culture. And I'll admit it, they had a point. A lot on the left got this wrong. But to those on the right who've made these arguments, I'd remind them to stick to the principles they claim to support. And to others on the left, now is the time for us to be unequivocal in our support for free speech. If we don't defend these principles, then these principles won't be left to defend us. Hi, my name is Brendan and thank you for watching that. If you found that interesting, then I recommend you check out this video all about lived experience. It's about how a good idea can twist into something else and end up hurting the very people it's meant to help.